All right. Well, how's it going, everybody? How's it going, Union Army Ball, Man of Steel, and Red Dundonian? I appreciate y'all being here with us. So I'm going to be reading through Carl Schmitt's Theory of the Partisan. And I put a link to a PDF. It's a shorter PDF, 56 pages. I'm going to be reading a book that has 95 pages, but just in case, I left y'all the link just in case y'all do want to read it. So let me go ahead. I will say this. I did that a little prematurely. I have 293 followers. I don't have 300. But you know what? I decided, why not? I'm just going to do it. I saw this channel that has Shaw Brothers movies that they put up. You know, there's this one guy. It's like called Classic Hong Kong Movies, Classic HK Movies, and they put up like 10 or 15 old Shaw Brothers movies from like the 70s, various ones too. Not just kung fu movies, but they've done like, they've done some of the musicals, and they did this one, Agent 009, which is an offshoot of 007. How's it going, Temujin? But they always get BTFO'd eventually, but you have to download them. And I saw that they had a version of Fast Fingers. We did a stream over talking about that movie because I guess Celestial Pictures, the company that owns the Shaw Brothers catalog, doesn't care about that one, but I saw a version of it that's in Cantonese, and Cantonese and Mandarin, they have differences. But yeah, wait, why is it shorter than the actual book? I have no idea, to be honest with you. But I was just taking a brief look at it. But yeah, I love that song. I don't care. I think Fast Fingers is one of my favorite. At least Shaw Brothers movies, I'll put it that way. With that out the way, though, and kind of an explanation of that, let's get into Theory of the Partisan by Carl Schmitt. Oh, wait a minute. No, I should probably explain this. So Carl Schmitt was a legal... Hold on. The PDF is from a website called DPRK course. Oh, okay. Hold on. Let me see if I can find another one. Y'all want me... Yeah, DPRK NOSBO. Okay. Let me see here. Let me see if I can find another one here. Whoops, sorry, I can't spell worth a damn, can I? Theory of the Partisan PDF. I clicked on the first one that, yeah, let me see here. ResearchGate, I know that's not good. I'm not going to make y'all buy the book. Let me see here. Okay, Princeton.edu. Let's see here. Okay, now this is 23 pages. So this is somebody's paper about Carl Schmitt. Okay. In the end, Schmitt relinquished his hope that the partisan could reveal a meaningful notion of enmity, yet this particular narrative of the partisan as victim did not exhaust Schmitt's account. In the second part of the essay, I will abstract a number of claims. Oh, okay. So this is like somebody's dissertation or something like that about Schmitt. There is the Schmittian claim that territorially delimited. Now, to be sure, all of these Schmittian claims are hardly speculative, and none should be taken at face value. Like much of Schmitt's work, they are neither clearly based on logical reasoning nor grounded in systematic. Yet, as I argue to... So this is just, a brief history. Schmitt had become particularly interested in the partisan and his relation to the political. In the early 1960s, his thinking had taken off from a book by a journalist. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm getting lost in this here. I am curious. Well, this sounds interesting as hell. Primarily states that were using partisan for their own purposes inspired by realpolitik. Okay, let me see here. This is interesting as hell. I'm sorry, I get off track about stuff. Okay, however, even more disquieting might be another element of Schmitt's thought. He held the emergence of subsequent importance of the partisan, and by the implication, the transnational terrorists are symptoms of the decay of a wider system of law centered on particular political forms. Yes, that's true about Schmitt, though, yeah. One might say, then, to resist a Schmittian approach to the war on terror, a two-part strategy is necessary. On the one hand, we want to show why the normative void is morally, legally, and strategically wrong. However, to fully make... Okay, I'm sorry. I'm getting off track, y'all. I'm sorry about that. So in the end, Schmitt's challenge to liberal thought is arguably much more complex and also more comprehensive than might be apparent at first sight. Successfully contesting current strategies in the global war on terror, if seen through a Schmittian lens, will require at least a moral, legal argument as well as a larger structural reading of the global context. So this was, okay, apparently this was like a paper that some guy wrote at Princeton University in March of 2007. That's interesting as hell. I'm going to try to read that. Let me go ahead and download that. Let me go ahead and drop the link. I'll drop the link in here just to be fair, as I know you're like, what's going on? Oh, you didn't miss anything, Karn. Thoughts on Pol Pot? I think Pol Pot was all right. I don't have a problem with the guy. There we go. I'll go ahead and drop that in. Hope y'all enjoy that. So basically, that's kind of, yeah. Call him a psychopath. Oh, yeah. Okay, but just to make sure, Carl Schmitt was a legal mind, basically, of the Nazi regime. He was also good friends with, I mean, it's a small world, as it always is, but he was good friends with Ernst Jünger as well. Going back and forth, seeing him in Paris because Ernst Jünger was stationed in Paris during the German occupation. And, Carl Schmitt was somebody that inspired a lot of different folks, in terms of legal writing. So I'll read this off here. So this is so this book is called Theory of the Partisan. This is when Carl Schmitt was more interested in, partisan movements. And this is starting in the 1960s. Let me see what we got here. So I'll start with the introduction here. So primarily, I think he's going to be talking about like 1808 to 1813, but he's going to talk a little bit about Mao as well. He's going to talk a little bit about Mao and Lenin in this. Let me see here. Yeah. From the Partisan as a Prussian ideal in 1813 and the turn to theory from Clausewitz to Lenin, and then from Lenin to Mao Zedong, from Mao Zedong to Raoul Salan. And I figured I was inspired by Anand Kazan. I heard that, I heard a bit of what he was reading with the National Bolshevist Manifesto, which I think is very interesting to read. Get an idea of the theory behind it. But let's go ahead and continue on here. I'm reading from a book because I'm a boomer. I also feel like, it's I have a book. It's just easier. So, view of the initial situation in 1808 to 1813. This is the introduction. The initial situation for our consideration of the problem of the partisan is the guerrilla war that the Spanish people waged against the army of a foreign conqueror from 1808 to until 1813. In this war, a people, a pre-bourgeois, pre-industrial, pre-conventional nation, for the first time confronted a modern, well-organized regular army that had evolved from the experiences of the French Revolution. Thereby, new horizons of war opened, new concepts of war developed, and a new theory of war and politics emerged. The partisan fights irregularly, but the difference between regular and irregular battle depends on the precision of the regular, and finds its concrete antithesis, and thereby its concept only in modern forms of organization, which originated in the wars of the French Revolution. During all ages of humanity and its many wars and battles, there have been rules of war and battle, and thus also transgression and disregard of those rules. In particular, during times of dissolution, e.g. the 30 Years' War on German soil, 1618 to 1648, and all civil and colonial wars in world history, there have been recurring phenomena that can be called partisan. Yet, for a complete theory of the partisan, it is important to recognize that the power and significance of his irregularity has been dependent on the power and significance of the regularity that he challenges. Makes sense? Makes a lot of sense, yeah. I think that, obviously it's important to talk about, how these irregular forces are going, but you have to talk about what these regular forces that they're fighting. I mean, I'm sure that there's analysis out there between what Rogers Rangers did and how they're organized against the British Army, for example, or the various holy shit, I can't think of the words now, mercenaries who fought for the British, such as the Hessians. But yeah, or even, of course, talking about the United States Army and the Viet Cong, or what he's going to talk about here, I imagine, talking about Mao and Lenin in particular. He goes from Lenin to Mao Zedong, from Mao Zedong to Raoul Salan. So this is, like I said, this is going to go for probably an hour and a half. What's going on, Anand Kazan? I was inspired by your reading of the National Bolshevist Manifesto to read The Theory of the Partisan. There's about a 95-page book from good old, or actually these are two lectures that Carl Schmitt gave in 1962, I believe. And so we'll go ahead and cover this a bit more. But basically, he was saying is that, you have to judge the irregular forces. To judge the irregular force, you have to judge the regular forces that they were fighting. And another example, too, more specifically, I was talking about the Viet Cong, but would be the Tet Offensive, and covering that and how that worked as an irregular fighting force. Yeah. Those felt like ants were calling. Oh, yeah, that's all good. It's all good, Ankaz. I don't blame you. It is all right, sir. If you don't feel good, Biggin, go ahead and stop, Okay, let's go ahead and continue on here. The regularity that he challenges. Precisely this regularity of the state, as well as of the army, obtained a new exact resolution in the French state, as well as in the French army through Napoleon. Countless Indian wars of the white conquerors against the American redskins from the 17th to 19th century, as well as the methods of the riflemen in the American War of Independence. See, I kind of covered this a little bit. Against the regular English army, 1774 to 1783, and the Civil War in the Vendée between Chouans and Jacobins, all still belong to the pre-Napoleonic stage. The new art of war of Napoleon's regular army originated in the new revolutionary form of battle. A Prussian officer from that time saw Napoleon's whole campaign against Prussia in 1806. Okay, my cat is going wild here. Give me a minute, folks, because she has to go out and run around. And yeah, she. Okay, you want to go out? Come on, sweetie. Get. Come on. There you go. All right.
Do I need to?
Huh?
Do you need milk or?
No. I'll get some here in a little bit. I'm doing some reading and whatnot. Okay, here we go. All right, sorry about that. Whew. It's always something. Okay. Are you sure that this cat, not a tiger? She gets wild. She has her times when she's very wild. Ole, definitely. Yeah, she'll. Yeah. Okay. New art of war. Prussian officer from that time saw Napoleon's whole campaign against Prussia in 1806 as merely partisan warfare on a grand scale. The partisan of the Spanish guerrilla war of 1808 was the first who dared to fight irregularly against the first modern regular army. Napoleon had defeated the regular Spanish army in the fall of 1808. The actual Spanish guerrilla war began only after this defeat of the regular army. There is not yet a complete documented history of the Spanish partisan war. This history, as Fernando Solano Costa has observed, is necessary but also very difficult, because the entire Spanish guerrilla war consisted of nearly 200 small regional wars in Asturias, Aragon, Catalonia, Navarra, Castile, etc., all under the leadership of numerous fighters whose names are shrouded in many myths and legends. One of them, Juan Martín Díez, known as Empecinado, became the terror of the French. and made the road from Madrid to Saragossa unsafe. This partisan war waged on both sides with the utmost cruelty, and it is no wonder that more historical materials, books, memoirs, have been published by the educated friends of the French, by the guerrillas. But as always, myths and legends on the one hand, and documented history on the other may be complementary. In any case, the lines of our initial situation are clear. According to Clausewitz, half of the entire French army was posted in Spain, and half of this number, 250,000 to 260,000 men, were engaged with the guerrillas, whose number has been estimated by Gomez de Artec at 50,000, and by others at being much lower. Colonel Autism, I am talking about Theory of the Partisan, a book by Carl Schmitt. These are lectures that he gave in 1962. And right now we're basically covering the Spanish partisans who, I guess, dabbed on the French in the wars of between 1808 and 1813. So very interesting to say the least. So there were about 260,000 men were fighting in Spain, whose number has been estimated at 50,000, others being much lower. So there's a lot of context. Yeah, can't wait to listen to streams on everybody's reading stream. Very high tier content. Appreciate it, Comrade Romano. Primarily important in the situation of the Spanish partisan in 1808 was the fact that he risked battle on his own home soil, while the king and his family were not yet able to tell exactly who was the real enemy. In this respect, the legitimate authority of Spain did not act differently from the one in Germany. Another feature of the Spanish situation was that the educated strata of the nobility, the high clergy, and the bourgeoisie were mostly afrancesados, i.e., they sympathized with the foreign conqueror, although in this respect there were parallels with Germany, where the great German poet Goethe wrote hymns to Napoleon's glory, and the German educated elite never were certain about where it belonged. In Spain, the guerrilla dared the hopeless fight. He was a poor devil, the first typical case of the irregular cannon fodder of the global political conflicts. All of this is part of an overture to a theory of the partisan. At that time, a spark jumped from Spain to the north. It did not ignite the same fire that gave the Spanish guerrilla war its world historical significance, but it produced an effect whose continuation today, in the second half of the 20th century, changes the face of the earth and her humanity. Dabbing on the French is a Spanish tradition at this point. Dad told me his Spanish professor went to Joseph Napoleon's grave just to piss on it. You got to give him that. Like I say, you got to be able to do that. You got to dab on him. Oh, boy. All right. We're going to skip ahead a little bit here, but yeah. So now we're going to jump to, at first in 1809, during the short war waged by the Austro-Hungarian Empire against Napoleon, a systematic attempt was made to emulate the Spanish model, with the help of famous publicists, among them Friedrich Genz and Friedrich Schlegel. The Austrian government in Vienna staged a national propaganda campaign against Napoleon. Interesting. Spanish writings were disseminated in German. Heinrich von Kleist. I wonder if he's related to the German general with the same, or the German general of the same name, Ewald von Kleist, in the Second World War. Joined in this anti-French propaganda and continued it in Berlin after this Austrian War of 1809. In these years until his death in November 1811, he became the real poet of the national resistance against the foreign conqueror. His play, Der Hermannschlacht, the Battle of Hermann, is the greatest partisan poem of all times. He also wrote a poem titled An Palafox, to Palafox, and put the defender of Saragossa in the same company as Leonidas, Arminius, and William Tell. The well-known fact that the reformers in the Prussian general staff, most notably August von Gneisenau and Gerhard von Scharnhorst, were deeply impressed by the Spanish example will be discussed below. Interesting. On the origins of the book, On War, through which the name Karl von Clausewitz acquired an almost mythical resonance, also can be found in the world of ideas of these Prussian staff officers from 1808 to 1813. His formula of war as a continuation of politics already contains in a nutshell a theory of the partisan whose logic has been pursued to its end by Lenin and Mao Zedong. So there you go. It's called Pepe Botella for alleged alcoholism. I thought it was Botachon. I thought Botachon meant maybe I'm thinking of a different. Maybe that's I don't know. Anyway, I thought drunkard was Botachon. Anyway, I only know that because of an episode of Law and Order, but being honest with you. Okay. Anyway. So yeah, we're talking about Clausewitz here a little bit. The only real guerrilla war of national liberation that should be mentioned in the context of our partisan problem was waged in Tyrol, where Andreas Hofer, Joseph Speckbacher, and the Capuchin friar Joachim Happinger were active. The Tyroleans became a mighty torch, as Clausewitz put it. However, the 1809 episode ended quickly. There is no partisan warfare against the French in the rest of Germany. The strong national impulse manifested in individual revolts and raiding parties ended very quickly and had no impact on the course of the regular war. Ooh, excuse me. Botachon is, okay. Bottle like he can't let go of the bottle. Oh, okay. Excuse me. See? Like I say, I've lived in Texas for so long, and yet I don't know a lick of Spanish or understand the idea. And I know it's a whole different type of thing. I'm surprised Schmitt didn't reference the Heidemachs but we're just at the beginning. I might be surprised. Oh, okay. I have never heard that. Schmitt was Nosbo gang? I think Schmitt was just a legal guy. He was a lawyer. I think was more of a theorist sort of guy. I think that he was just kind of somewhere in between, but yeah. Let's see what we got here. Okay. Conflicts of the spring and summer 1813 took place on the battlefield, and the decisive blow was struck in a pitched battle near Leipzig in October 1813. In the course of a general restoration, the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, also reestablished the concepts of European laws of war. This was one of the most remarkable restorations in world history. It was so enormously successful that these laws of war regarding bracketed continental land war still dominated the military conduct of European land war during World War I. During World War I. Until today, these laws of war are called classical, and they deserve the name because they recognize clear distinctions above all between war and peace, combatants and non-combatants, enemy and criminal. This is one of the big things of Carl Schmitt. I know that it's a big meme nowadays because now people are trying to act, somewhat big brain by saying, "Oh yeah, well I know about Carl Schmitt because he talks about the enemy and all, the difference between enemy and friend." Like I say, it's a little bit more complicated, I'm sure, than that. But such is the way. Things always get co-opted, and they go back and forth, unfortunately. Let me see what we got here. Enemy and criminal. Okay, yeah, that's what I meant. War was waged between states, between regular state armies, and between sovereign bearers of jus belli, the right to war, who also in war respected each other as enemies, and did not discriminate against each other as criminals, so that a peace treaty was possible and even constituted the normal self-evident end of war. Given such a classical regularity, as long as it actually held sway, the partisan could be only a marginal phenomenon, which in fact was even during World War I. Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to the idea of chivalry and, having respect for your enemy and having a declaration of war. Nowadays, the United States doesn't have to declare war. They can just do what they want. I think that kind of speaks to a different time. Okay. The horizon of our investigation. If I have occasion to speak about modern theories of the partisan, then I must emphasize that there are actually no old theories of the partisan as distinguished from modern ones. In the classical laws of war of European international law, there is no place for the partisan in the modern sense. He was either, as in the cabinet of wars of the 18th century, a lighter, especially more mobile, but nonetheless regular type of troop, or, being a particularly gruesome criminal, he was simply outside the law, hors la loi. As long as the notion of duel with open weapons and chivalry remained in war, this could not have been otherwise. With the introduction of compulsory military service, all wars became, in principle, wars of national liberation. And this soon leads to a situation that is difficult and often irresolvable for the classical laws of war, such as the more or less improvised mass conscription or the Freikorps and the Francs-Tireurs, which I will discuss later. Fundamentally, in any case, war remains bracketed, and the partisan stands outside of this bracketing. Yeah, U.S. doesn't have to declare war since it was always at war. That's true. Yeah, that was more of a formality. Nowadays, war declarations start with economic embargoes or some assassinations. Yeah, that is true. The fact that this bracketing now becomes a matter of his essence and his existence. The modern partisan expects neither law nor mercy from the enemy. Yeah, this is kind of like, I'm trying to put this into context when I read this, because like some of this is, I know nothing about the partisan wars that happened in Spain against Napoleon. I had no idea about any of that, but still fascinating. This whole thing about, no quarter given, none expected sort of thing that very much paints what World War II became like, it's like, when you see the whole, the Goebbels thing with the whole, do you want total war? Yes. And of course, like I say, that's a lot of that is theater, but still, I think that's kind of the idea. Now, of course, Mr. Schmitt isn't going to do that because he doesn't want to have any connection to the Third Reich, which isn't surprising. Let's see here. He has moved away from the conventional enmity of controlled and bracketed war and into the realm of another, real enmity, which intensifies through terror and counter-terror until it ends in extermination. Yeah, peace doesn't know what the USA means. That's true. Yeah, definitely the terror and the counter-terror aspect in terms of extermination. That's very true. Given the situation of the partisan, two types of war are especially important and in a certain sense related to it: civil war and colonial war. Today, this context is very specific. Classical European international law pushed both of these dangerous forms of war and enmity, I cannot pronounce that word for the life of me, enmity, to the margins. In the Jus Publicum Europaeanum, public law of Europe, war was waged between states, and was war that a regular state army waged against another regular state army. Open civil war was considered to be armed insurrection, which was defeated with the help of a state of... Here we go. I know I'm going to say the gamer word here, but yeah. With the help of a state of siege by police and troops, unless it led to recognition of the rebels as belligerents. Colonial war still remains within the purview of the military science of European nations, such as England, France, and Spain. Yet, this does not challenge regular state war as the classical model. Okay, he's basically kind of setting out the rules and everything else like that, and basically just saying, acknowledging whether or not these belligerents are they're actually legitimate or you're going to give them legitimacy, or they're all just LARPers. It's kind of like what happened with January 6th, is that now they have to declare these, they have to declare these folks as legitimate threats to the government, And now, of course, like I say, now they're being chased down by the FBI. Families are turning them in, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe I'm using this in a bad faith context, but that's the context that I think of. So, yeah. Just saying. I mean, those are my thoughts about it. I'm giving my commentary as we go along. That way, hopefully, it's a little more easier to connect. It also helps me, too, to try to get a sense of idea. Yeah. Fourth generational warfare. You're talking about nowadays. I have a book about states nowadays. I begin involved in wars that they didn't start. Yeah. America has been at war for very long. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Here, Russia in particular must be mentioned. During the entire 19th century, the Russian army waged many wars against the Asiatic mountain peoples and never restricted itself exclusively to regular army wars, as did the Prussian-German army. Excuse me. Furthermore, the Otto-Cattonist partisan war against Napoleon's army is part of Russian history. In the summer of 1812, Russian partisans under military leadership harassed the French army in its advance on Moscow. In fall and winter of the same year, Russian peasants killed the cold and hungry French army in its retreat. Ah, well, there you go. Oh, it's a torrent site? Oh, okay. So once again, Russia was known for their partisans. This kind of goes back to, of course, the Second World War as well. As far as I know, and like I say, I try to say this in every video, but if I say something that's a bit, hinky or doesn't feel right, please say so. But as far as I know, the Red Army controlled the partisans. As far as I know, they were led by a Red Army general. So as far as I know, the partisans did have some control that the Red Army had. So I think that's very interesting. Yeah, Siberian riflemen. Oh, okay, yeah. But I didn't know that, where the peasants were killing were dabbing on the French army by killing the partisans under military leadership harassed the French army, advance on Moscow. Same year, Russian peasants killed the cold and hungry French army in its retreat. Wow. There you go. All of this did not last much longer than half a year, but it sufficed to become a historical event of great import. Admittedly, more through its political myth and its different interpretations than through its paradigmatic impact on the theoretical science of war. Here we must mention at least two different, even conflicting interpretations of the Russian partisan war of 1812. An anarchistic one, based on Michael Bakunin and Peter Kropotkin, which became famous in Leo Tolstoy's novel War and Peace, and the Bolshevik utilization in Stalin's tactics of strategy of revolutionary war. See, here we go. We're talking a little bit about different stuff here. We're going to talk about some 20th century stuff here. Okay. Tolstoy was not an anarchist like Bakunin or Kropotkin, but his literary influence was much greater. His epic War and Peace contains more myth-building power than any political doctrine or any documented history. Tolstoy elevated the Russian partisans of 1812 to bearers of the elemental powers of the Russian earth, which shook off the famous Emperor Napoleon and his splendid army like some onerous vermin. A lot of French deserted to Belarus. Oh, really? Huh. Interesting. For Tolstoy, the uneducated, illiterate peasant not only is stronger, but also more intelligent than all strategists and tacticians. Above all, he is more intelligent than the great General Napoleon. who becomes a puppet in the hands of historical events. During World War II, Stalin adopted this myth of the indigenous national partisan against Germany. Oh, he does mention it. What's that? Oh, okay. Something else. Sorry. Apologies, folks. Okay. Didn't mean to be screaming in the mic there. Okay. Stalin adopted the myth of the indigenous national partisan against Germany and put it very concretely into the service of his communist world politics. This constituted an essentially new stage of partisan warfare, which began with Mao Zedong. See, we're getting, like I say, this was written in 1962, so, all right. For 30 years, partisan warfare had been pursued in many parts of the earth. It began in 1927 before World War II in China and other Asiatic countries, which had later defended themselves against the Japanese invasion from 1932 to 1945. During World War II, Russia, Poland, the Balkans, France, Albania, Greece, and other countries became theaters of this type of warfare. After World War II, partisan warfare continued in Indochina, where the Vietnamese communist leader Ho Chi Minh and the victor of Dien Bien Phu, General Vo Nguyen Giap, organized it with peculiar effect against the French colonial army. Moreover, partisan warfare continued in Malaya, the Philippines, Algeria, Cyprus under General George Grivas, and Cuba under Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. At present, in 1962, the Indo-Chinese countries of Laos and Vietnam are theaters of partisan warfare, which daily develops new methods of overpowering and outwitting the enemy. Modern technology provides ever stronger weapons and means of destruction, ever more perfected means of transportation and methods of communication for the partisans, as well as for the regular troops who fight them. In the vicious cycle of terror and counter-terror, combat against partisans is often only a mirror image of partisan warfare. And time and again, the correctness of the old adage, usually cited as Napoleon's order to General Lefebvre, I think that's how you pronounce it, on September 12, 1813, proves to be true. In fighting the partisan anywhere, one must fight like a partisan. I'm not going to say it in French, but yeah. Some particular questions regarding norms in jurisprudence and international law will be elaborated below. The fundamentals are self-evident. The application to rapidly developing concrete situations is controversial. In recent years, an impressive document of the will to total resistance, and not only the will, but also the detailed orders for its concrete execution, has appeared. The Swiss Everyman's Guide to Guerrilla Warfare, published by the Swiss Association of Non-Commissioned Officers. In 180 pages, it offers instructions for passive and active resistance against a foreign invasion, with detailed suggestions for sabotage, going underground, concealing weapons, surprise attacks, combating spies, etc. The experiences of the last decades are utilized scrupulously. This Everyman's War Guide begins with the remark that resistance to the end must adhere to the 1907 Hague Convention respecting the laws and customs of war on land, and to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. This goes without saying. It is also not difficult to calculate how a normal, regular army would react to the practical application of these directions for guerrilla warfare, e.g., silent killing of guards by hitting them with an axe, as long as it did not feel it had been defeated. Very, very interesting. So, like I said, this was 1962 that this was written, but yeah, very, very cogent. The brief listing of a few known names and events with which we have attempted an initial outline of the horizon of our views demonstrates an immeasurable wealth of the subject and the problem. It thus is advisable to define some features and criteria more precisely, so that the discussion does not become abstract and boundless. One feature we mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, when we assumed that the partisan is an irregular fighter, The regular fighter is identified by a soldier's uniform, which is more of a professional garb. Because it demonstrates the dominance of the public sphere, the weapon is displayed openly and demonstratively with the uniform. The enemy soldier in uniform is the actual target of the modern partisan. Another feature that comes to the foray today is the intense political engagement that distinguishes the partisan from other fighters. The intense political character of the partisan must be kept in mind, because he must be distinguished from the ordinary thief and violent criminal whose motives are directed towards private enrichment. This conceptual criterion of the political character of the partisan has, in exact inversion, the same structure as does the pirate in the law of sea war. The concept of the pirate has the unpolitical character of his evil deeds, which are focused on private robbery and profit. The pirate has, as jurists say, animus furandi, evil intent. The partisan fights at a political front, and precisely the political character of his acts restore the original meaning of the word partisan. The word derives from party, and refers to the tie to a fighting, belligerent, or politically active party or group. These ties to a party become especially strong in revolutionary times. In Revolutionary War, belonging to a revolutionary party implies no less than the total inclusion, and a revolutionary fighting party can integrate its active combatants totally, whereas that is not possible for other groups and associations, in particular the contemporary state. In the comprehensible discussion concerning the so-called total state, it has not been realized that today it is not the state, but rather the Revolutionary Party that represents the actual and, in fact, the only totalitarian organization. In purely organizational terms, in terms of the strict functioning of protection and obedience, some revolutionary organizations are superior to some regular troops. If organization is made a criterion of regularity, as occurred in the 1949 Geneva Conventions, then there will be confusion in the international law of war. The word partisan means one who follows a party, and that means concretely very different at different times. This also is true with respect to the party or the front someone belongs to, and also with respect to following fellow traveling comrades in arms, and eventually to becoming fellow captives. There are belligerent parties, but also parties in judicial processes, parties of parliamentary democracy, parties of opinion and activism, etc. In Romantic languages, the partisan can be used as a noun and as an adjective. In French, one can speak of the partisan of some opinion. In short, a very general, ambiguous designation suddenly becomes a highly political word. Linguistic parallels with a general term like status, which suddenly can mean state, come to mind. In times of dissolution, as in the 17th century during the 30 Years' War, the irregular soldier fell into the company of street robbers and vagrants. He waged war for personal profit and became a figure of the picaresque novel like Estambillo Gonzalez's Spanish Picaro, or Rogue, who is associated with the Battle of Nordlingen, and told about it in the style of the good soldier Schwick. See now, okay, let's go ahead and let me take a pause here for a moment. So I think that there needs to be a little more separation here. I think when Schmitt talks about the difference between I think he is kind of separating out, but this is still a book from 1962. So I think that he's talking about, the difference of how this word partisan can be used. The thing is, today we would call those people mercenaries. And those are folks that do it for the money. Like, for example, kind of like the Hessians that the British used, in the Revolutionary War against the American colonists and the Revolutionary Army. But he'll probably spell this out. I'm just taking a brief break here. Okay, just getting my breath back. Okay. In the 18th century, the party follower belonged to the Pandours, the Hussars, and other types of light troops, which, as mobile troops, fight separately and pursue so-called small wars by comparison with the slower great wars of regular troops. Here, the distinction between regular and irregular is meant in solely military technical terms, and in no sense is synonymous with the legal and illegal in the juridical sense of international and constitutional law. As regards contemporary partisans, the antithetical pairs of regular, irregular, and legal, illegal usually become blurred and interchangeable. Yeah, that's fair. Flexibility, speed, and the ability to switch from attack to retreat, i.e. increased mobility, remains today a characteristic of the partisan. And this characteristic is even more intensified through technicization and motorization. Both antithetical pairs, regular, irregular, legal, and illegal, are dissolved only in Revolutionary War, when numerous semi- and para-regular groups come into being. But the armed partisan remains dependent on cooperation with a regular organization. Fidel Castro's comrade in arms in Cuba, Ernesto Che Guevara, is an especially good example. Consequently, some intermediary stages develop through the cooperation of regular and irregular, also in cases by a no means revolutionary government calls for defense of the national soil against a foreign invader. A war of national liberation and a guerrilla war then become one. The designation partisan has obtained in official calls to arms since the 16th century. We still will become acquainted with two important examples of a former regulation of wars, of national liberation, and of local militias tried to regulate guerrilla warfare. But the foreign invader also issues regulations for combating enemy partisans. I'll see you later, Rendondonian. All such uniform codes face the difficult problem of an international legal regulation, i.e., a regulation of the irregular that is valid for both sides regarding, on one hand, recognition of the partisan as a combatant and his treatment as a prisoner of war, and, on the other, respect for the rights of the occupying military power. We already have mentioned that in this respect there are some juridical controversies, and we will return to the debate concerning the francs-tireurs of the Franco-German War, 1870 to 1871, after we examine the situation in international law. Oh wow, so they do cite Ernesto Che Guevara on guerrilla warfare. I do have that book as well. Maybe I'll read it one day. But yeah. In general, and in view of the rapid changes in the world, the tendency of traditional or so-called classical concepts, as one likes to call them today, to be changed or also to be dissolved is all too understandable. This is also the case with the classical, if one may call it that, concept of the partisan. In a very important book for our subject, the illegal resistance fighter and the underground activist are made the true type of partisan. This is a conceptual transformation oriented primarily to certain inner German situations of the Hitler time, and has this aim in view. Illegality is substituted for irregularity, resistance for military combat. It appears to me that this implies a wide-ranging reinterpretation of the partisan of wars of national liberation, and a feature to recognize that even the revolutionizing of war has not forsaken the military connection between the regular soldier and the irregular fighter. In some cases, the reinterpretation leads to a general symbolization and dissolution of the concept. Then, ultimately, any individualist and nonconformist can be called a partisan without any consideration as to whether he would think of taking up arms. As a metaphor, this may be permissible, but for me, the term partisan defines specific historical figures and situations. In a general sense, we may say to be a man is to be a fighter, and the consistent individualist does indeed fight on his own terms, and if he is courageous, at his own risk. He then becomes his own party follower. Such consensual dissolutions are noteworthy signs of the times. We deserve a separate examination. Yet, for a theory of the partisan as it meant here, Carl Schmitt win, yeah, eventually. One day. Yet for a theory of the partisan as meant here, a number of criteria must be kept in mind, so that the theme does not dissolve into abstract generalities. Such criteria are irregularity, increased mobility of active combat, and increased intensity of political engagement. Okay. So, like I say, we're going to take a short little break here and talk about this for a minute. So, he's laid this out very well. And he's going back and forth and re-explaining himself here. So, yeah. Irregularity, increased mobility of active combat, and increased intensity of political engagement. So, yeah. So, I mean, in modern day context as well, we've talked a little bit about Mao Zedong, and we've talked a little bit about the Viet Minh. But also, how's it going, Superpower Broadcasting? We're reading some Carl Schmitt here, talking about the partisan, the theory of the partisan. But I would say as well, speaking of Superpower Broadcasting, I was going to say Hezbollah would be a perfect example of being a partisan. Active combat, increased intensity of political engagement. A lot of folks, Hezbollah has a lot of power, not only militarily, but also politically. You haven't read this? Oh, okay. It's a very interesting book. It is a very interesting book. I put a link to it in the description. So if you do want to check it out, you can. Very interesting book, though. Do you think Schmitt is cringe or base? I think, well, that's your opinion, Hezbollah. That's fine. What I would say is I think that Schmitt served his purpose for the time. I think that he was a jurist and someone who spoke for the time, yeah. Yeah, that's okay. No problem. That's fine. You can do what you want. But yeah, I'll go ahead and continue on here with this. I would like to retain a further fourth characteristic of the true partisan, which Hover Zamora has called the telluric. Despite all tactical ability, this characteristic is important for the basically defensive situation of the partisan, who changes his essence once he identifies with the absolute aggressivity of a world revolutionary or a technistic ideology. Two especially interesting discussions of the theme, the book by Rolf Schurz and the dissertation by Jörg H. Schmid about the position of the partisan in international law, basically correspond to these criteria. Zamora's stress on the telluric character of the partisan seems to me necessary in order to make the defensive, i.e. the limited nature of hostility, spatially evident, and to guard it against the absolute claim of an abstract justice. For the partisans who fought in Spain from 1803 to 1813, Tyrol and Russia, this is self-evident. But also the partisan struggles during World War II and the years thereafter in Indochina and other countries well identified by the names of Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, and Fidel Castro, indicate that the tie to the soil, the autochthonous population, and the geographical particularity of the land, mountain ranges, forests, jungles, or deserts, are topical even today. The partisan is and remains distinct, not only from the pirate, but likewise from the corsair, even as land and sea, as different from elemental spaces of human labor and military struggle between nations, remain distinct. Land and sea have developed not only different means of pursuing war in different theaters of war, but also different concepts of war, enemy and booty. Well, the thing is, I'll say this. We're not going to argue about that. What I'm saying is that this book was written in 1962, And Carl Schmitt, like I say, I don't think that he is loving Carl Schmitt or loving Mao Zedong or Che Guevara or Stalin. But what he is mentioning is just how these folks used partisan warfare to get what they wanted. And particularly, they're talking about the different regions and everything else. Yeah, he doesn't have any love for these folks. He's just using these as a comparison. Like I say, 1962, this kind of serves the time frame. This is only, like I say, the victory was in 1949. This book was based on 2 lectures that he gave, I believe in Spain, I think. But anyway, the telluric character of the partisan will be elucidated below through a comparison with typical figures in maritime law. He's analyzing organization and difference between mercenary and a partisan. Yeah, exactly. Yet oh my goodness, I gotta look up this word and look how it's pronounced. Yeah, autochthonous partisan of agrarian background is being drawn into the force field of irresistible. Okay, see you later. Not a problem, Superpower Broadcasting. Okay, that's fine. Okay, his mobility is increased by his motorization to such an extent that he is in danger of becoming completely disoriented. In the situations of the Cold War, he becomes a technician of the invisible struggle, a saboteur, a spy. Already during World War II, there were sabotaged troops with partisan training. Such a motorized partisan loses his telluric character and becomes only the transportable and exchangeable tool of powerful central agency of world politics, which deploys him in overt or covert war and deactivates him in the situation as the situation demands. This possibility is also part of his present-day existence and should not be neglected in a theory of the partisan. With these 4 criteria, irregularity, increased mobility, intensity of political engagement, and telluric character, and with reference to the possible impact of further technicization, industrialization, and de-agrarianization, we have outlined conceptually the horizon of our investigation. It ranges from the guerrilla of Napoleonic times to the well-equipped partisan of the present day, from Empecinado via Mao Zedong to Ho Chi Minh to Fidel Castro. This is a large field from which historiography and the science of war have elaborated an enormous amount of material that expands daily. We will utilize it as far as it is accessible to us and try to gain some insights from a theory of the partisan. It's okay. It's all good. Like I say, yeah. But yeah, it's all good. Like I say, I think that like I say, let me take a quick, short little break again here. I do want to say this is that with this, it's interesting to talk about kind of the evolution of the partisan and everything else. I think that he's very motorized partisan. I was gonna say, motorized one. I think is very interesting. So obviously, we have seen this, obviously in the 1970s and 80s, with a lot of the African wars that went back and forth, and everybody, they had the Toyota, they got that 80s Toyota, and they got the Soviet Dushka in the back, the big 50 cal in the back. And that's kind of the idea of being motorized. And a lot of the time they would, have their stuff that would get them, their version of peyote, this and that, and keep them going. So yeah, it's interesting to see how this evolved, and it can still be used today. But yeah, so now it's an organizational model. Yeah, exactly. Okay. Let's move on to view of the situation in international law. The partisan fights irregularly, but some categories of irregular fighters are equated with regular troops and enjoy the same rights and privileges. That means their acts of combat are not illegal. And if they are captured by their enemy, they have a right to special treatment as prisoners of war and as wounded. The legal situation was summarized in the 1907 Hague Convention, which today is accepted generally as valid. After World War II, the development was continued in the 1949 Geneva Conventions, two of which regulate the fate of wounded and sick in land, war, and sea war. The third regulates treatment of prisoners of war, and the fourth regulates protection of civilians during wartime. Numerous states of both the Western world and Eastern Bloc have ratified them, and their formulations also have been adopted in the New American Military Handbook of Land War Law, July 18, 1956. The 1907 Hague Convention, under certain conditions, equated militia, volunteer corps, and comrades-at-arms of spontaneous insurrections with regular troops. Later on in our discussion of Prussian incompatibility with partisan warfare, we will mention some difficulties and confusions caused by this regulation. The development that led to the 1949 Geneva Conventions is characteristic of the further loosening of the traditional European international law based on the state. Ever more categories of belligerents now are considered to be combatants. Civilians of territories militarily occupied by the enemy, i.e. those in the actual combat zone of partisans fighting behind enemy lines, now also enjoy greater legal protection than those accorded by the 1907 Hague Convention. Many comrades-at-arms who were considered to be partisans now are equated with regular combatants and have rights and privileges. In fact, they no longer can be called partisans, yet the concepts are still unclear and vague. And this is very true. This is the same thing when they had, when they would capture, ISIS fighters or capture folks from Al-Qaeda. And they were treated, and depending who they were, there were people like that, some of those white dudes that joined Al-Qaeda, and, they ended up, coming back to the U.S. and they're locked up now. But still, they are treated the same way as combatants. You can't just go around and shoot them and whatnot, even though, of course, there are plenty of extensions of that and plenty of violations of the Hague laws and indeed of the Geneva Convention. That definitely happened. Okay, the formulation of the 1949 Geneva Conventions have European experiences in view, but not Mao Zedong's partisan warfare and the later development of the modern partisan warfare. In the years immediately after 1945, it was not yet realized what an expert like Hermann Forst formulated this way. Belligerent actions after 1945 had assumed a partisan character because those who had nuclear bombs shunned using them for humanitarian reasons, and those who did not have them could count on these reservations. An unexpected effect of both the atomic bomb and humanitarian concerns. The norms of the 1945 Geneva Conventions, which are important from the problem of the partisans, are abstracted from particular situations. They are a precise reference to the resistance movements of World War II. A fundamental change in the 1907 Hague Convention went unnoticed. The four classical conditions for an equation with regular troops, responsible officers, firm and visible symbols, open display of weapons, observance of rules and application, and laws of war, were upheld rigidly. So it's very interesting. Like I said, it's very clear cut. What's up with gingers becoming jihadis? I have no idea what that Timmy Hen. They exist though. They do. But this is very clear cut. Where he's saying, openly showing your weapons, because obviously, you could hide them, in a coat or something like that. With regular forces, they have them right there. They got them slanged. They got them at the low ready. Observance of rules and application of the laws of war. Some sort of SOP on how to handle things. Are observed. Okay. Yet only the legal foundation for humanitarian interventions of the International Committee of the Red Cross and other nonpartisan organizations should be created. Inter arma caritas, between the arms of charity, in Article 3, Section 4 of the Convention, it is stated expressly that the legal position of the conflicting parties will not be affected. In wars between states, the occupying power of the militarily occupied area still has the right to direct local police of this area to maintain order and to suppress irregular hostile actions. By the same token, it also has the right to prosecute partisans without regard to which ideas inspired them. Accordingly, the distinction of partisans in the sense of irregular fighters, not equated with regular troops, even today remains fundamentally true. The partisan in this sense does not have the rights and privileges of combatants. He is a criminal according to ordinary law and should be made harmless with summary punishment and repressive measures. This was fundamentally recognized also in the war crimes trials in World War II, namely in the Nuremberg judgments against German generals Alfred Jodl, Wilhelm von Lieb, and Wilhelm List, whereby it was self-understood that beyond the necessary struggle against partisans, this included all of the atrocities, terroristic measures, collective punishments, or even participation in genocide and war crimes. So there's an example of that, but there's also, of course, everyone likes to mention the, I can't even think of his name now. Oh my goodness, I'm trying to think of the guy's name now. God damn it, I can't, this is going to bug the hell out of me now. What is his name? Oh my goodness. I'm trying to think of it now. Oh my goodness, I'm going to get there. Hold on. I think, oh my goodness, it's almost there. I see the picture, I just cannot picture his name. Derlevanger, that's his name. Okay. Yeah, the Derlevanger Brigade and all that sort of business, and sort of the anti-partisan type stuff that they engage in, yeah. The lack of soul would make sense for Takfiris. Gingers, no souls. Yeah, those gingers, I tell you got to watch out for them. Okay. The 1949 Geneva Conventions widened the circle of persons equated with regular fighters, above all, in that members of an organized resistance movement were equated with members of militias and voluntary corps, and in this way were granted the rights and privileges of regular combatants. There was no express stipulation regarding a military organization. The Convention of Wounded, Article 4, the Convention on the Protection of Civilian Populations mentioned international conflicts which would be settled by force of arms. The same way as wars between states in classical European international law, confirming thereby the core of a typical legal institution, military occupation, for the traditional laws of war. To such expansions and relaxations, which here can be indicated only by way of example, are added to the great transformations and changes that result from development of modern weapons technology, which we have a still more intense effect on partisan warfare. For example, what is the meaning of the rule that weapons must be carried openly? When a resistance fighter in the Swiss Every Man's Guide to Guerrilla Warfare says, "Move only at night and rest in the woods during the day." Well, what is the meaning of the requirement of a clearly visible badge of rank during combat at night or in contest between long-range weapons of modern technical warfare? Many such questions come to the fore. In the discussion is considered the viewpoint of the problem of the partisan, and if aspects of spatial changes and techno-industrial development are considered. Protection of civilian populations in militarily occupied areas is protection in many respects. The occupying power has an interest in seeing that peace and order obtain in the militarily occupied area. The population of the occupied area is obligated certainly not to fidelity, but rather to obedience with respect to the regulations of the occupying power that are in accord with the laws of war. Even civil servants, including the police, should continue to work correctly and correspondingly should be handled correctly by the occupying power. The whole matter is an extremely difficult balanced compromise between the interests of the occupying power and those of the enemy. The partisan disturbs this type of order in the occupied area in a dangerous way, not only because his proper field of battle is the area behind the enemy's front line, where he upsets transport and supply, but also if he's more or less supported and hidden by the indigenous population. The population is your best friend, according to the Everyman's Guide to Guerrilla Warfare. Protection of such an indigenous population, then, is potentially also protection of the partisan. This explains why, in the history of the development of the laws of land of war, in the deliberations of the 1907 Hague Convention, and its further development, a typical oppositional grouping always enters the picture. The great military powers, namely the potential occupying powers, demanded strict rules of order in the military occupied area, whereas the smaller states, i.e. those that feared becoming military occupied, Belgium, Switzerland, and Luxembourg, sought at least further protection of resistance fighters and civilian population. Also, in this respect, developments since World War II have led to new perceptions, and destruction of social structures has raised the question of whether there also can be cases in which the population needs protection from the partisans. Very interesting, yeah. Oh boy, okay. So the 1945 Geneva Convention has introduced changes in the precisely regulated classical legal institutions of occupatio bellica of the 1907 Hague Convention, changes whose repercussions remain obscure in many respects. Resistance fighters who earlier were treated as partisans are equated with regular troops if they are organized. As opposed to the interests of the occupying power, the interests of the occupied territory's indigenous population are stressed so strongly that it becomes possible, at least in theory, that any resistance to an occupying power, also that of partisans, as long as it springs from respectable motives, is considered to be not illegal. Not illegal. I just want to make sure I say that. Nevertheless, the occupying power is justified in using repressive measures. In this situation, a partisan does not become actually legal, but also not actually illegal. He proceeds at his own risk, and, in this sense, is treated as being risky. If one uses words such as risk and risky in general, i.e. imprecise sense, then one must conclude that in an area militarily occupied by enemies and riddled with partisans, in no way is it only the partisan who lives at risk. In general, the sense of insecurity and danger, the area's entire population is at great risk. And so let me make sure I pause this here. But I want to make sure that this gets said. Definitely, as we're going through here, I'm going to continue to read through the book, The Avengers, A Jewish War Story as well. These were folks that hid in the Vilna ghetto. And so they would be considered, and they were partisans as well. They blew up trains, and they remained, under the control. It's very interesting, of course, because talking about Jacob Gens, who ran the Vilna ghetto, was a very, very much kept the order. They had, plays and everything like that to keep people happy. But ultimately, they were still in the ghetto. That's the whole thing. Yeah, fascinating bit here. But yeah, head of the Vilnius ghetto government, from a merchant family, he joined the Lithuanian army. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I don't know why I'm getting sleepy. It's only 6:30. But yeah. Friends, more like pawns. Yeah. Yeah. How do we know Harry Potter is fiction? The ginger has friends. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I'm going to skip down to this here. Thus, the word risky also has a precise meaning, namely that risky actions are treated at their own risk, and at worst, consequences of their successes or failure are taken for granted, so that there can be no question of injustice when the severest consequences ensue. But, by the same token, to the extent that risky actions are not treated as unjust acts, there is the possibility that risk can be balanced, that it can culminate in a security treaty. The judicial home of the concept of risk, its orientation, remains the right of insurance. Men live with diverse dangers and insecurities, and a danger or insecurity with judicial consequences prevents risk, meaning that it makes it and those affected by it insurable. With partisans, this might depend on the irregularity and illegality of their actions, even when one might be disposed to protect them technically by classifying them as highly dangerous and all too great a risk. For situations of war and the confirmation of enmity, consideration of the concept of risk is essential. In Germany, the word risk is entered the theory of war in international law through a book by Joseph L. Kunz. Yet risk in this book is not related to land war, and certainly not to the partisan. It also does not belong here, leaving aside the right of insurance as the judicial home of the concept of risk and the imprecise uses of the word. For example, the comparison with escaping prisoners who risk being shot. Kunz's specific and fruitful use of the concept risk pertains to the laws of the sea war, and he has typical figures and situations in mind. Sea war is largely a trade war. It has, as opposed to land war, its own space and its own concepts of enmity and booty. Even amelioration of the wounded has led to two conventions, one for land and another for sea, in the 1945 Geneva Regulations. In sea war, risky, used in such a specific sense, refers to two participants, the neutral blockade runner and the neutral contraband leader. With reference to both, the word is precise and meaningful. Both types of belligerents get involved in a very profitable, yet very risky commercial venture. They risk ship and freight in case they are caught. Thus, they have no enemy even if they are treated as an enemy in the sense of sea war law. Their social ideal is good business. Their field of operations is the free sea. They do not think about protecting house, herd, or home against a foreign invader, which is the archetype of the autochthonous partisan. They also conclude insurance treaties to compensate for their risk, whereby the insurance costs are correspondingly high, as are the changing risk factors. For example, being sunk by a submarine, very risky yet highly insured. One should not take such an apt word as risky out of the conceptual field of sea war law and let it become lost in an obscure general concept for us. Since we adhere to the telluric character of the partisan, this is especially important. If earlier, I once characterized freebooters and seafarers, UAB Republic of Texas, Part 2, yeah. Check this out. Oh, that's funny. Let's see what we got here. Let's see what we got. Okay, so criminal. Okay. freebooters as partisans of the sea. Today, I would like to correct this imprecise terminology. The partisan has an enemy and risks something completely different from blockade runners and contraband leaders. He risks not only his life, as does every regular combatant. He knows he accepts that he is an enemy outside of right, law, and honor. That is also true of the revolutionary fighter who declares his enemy to be a criminal, and that all concepts of right, law, and honor are ideological swindle. From World War II and the post-war period until today, despite all the characteristic links and mixtures of both types of partisans, defensive autochtonists, I pronounce it differently every time, defenders of the homeland, and globally aggressive revolutionary activists, the antithesis remains. It is based, and we will see, on fundamentally different concepts of war and enmity, which are realized in different types of partisans. Where war on both sides is pursued as a non-discriminatory fight between states, the partisan is a marginal figure who does not rupture the structure of war and does not change the total structure of the political process. However, if the war as a whole is fought with a criminalization of opponents, for example, civil war between class enemies, the ultimate goal is destruction of the enemy state's government. Then the revolutionary disruption of criminalization of the enemy follows in such a way that the partisan becomes the true hero of war. He enforces the death penalty against the criminal, and if the tables are turned, risks being treated as a criminal or a parasite. That is the logic of a war of just cause, without recognition of a just enemy. Thereby, the revolutionary partisan becomes the true central figure of war. However, the problem of the partisan becomes the best touchstone. The various types of partisan warfare still are so confused and fused in the praxis of contemporary war in their fundamental presuppositions. They remain so different that they test the criterion of the friend-enemy grouping. Earlier, we mentioned the typical oppositional grouping of the 1907 Hague Convention, the greatest military powers vis-a-vis the small neutral countries. In the deliberations of the 1945 Geneva Conventions, a compromise formula was achieved with great effort, whereby organized resistance fighters were equated with volunteers. Here also, the typical oppositional grouping reappeared when, in the light of the experiences of World War II, the endeavor was also made to embrace it in the norms of international law. Here also, the great military powers, the potential occupiers, were pitted against the small states that feared occupation. This time, however, with an equally striking and symptomatic modification, the world's greatest land power, the Soviet Union, which was the strongest potential occupier, stood now on the side of the small states. In Schmidt's substantive and well-documented work, he attempts to follow guerrilla warfare through civilians, concretely followed on Stalin's partisans, and to put them under the shield of law. This is how Schmitt sees the quintessence of the partisan problem and create legal achievement of the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Schmitt would like to see the renewal of remnants of occupational law, still emanating from the power of occupation, in particular the much-praised duty of obedience. To this end, he relies on the theory of the legal, though risky, conduct of war, which he accentuates in a risky but not illegal conduct of war. Thus, he minimizes the risk of partisans, which he writes off as the cost of the occupying power, given its many rights and privileges. How he intends to oppose the logic of terror and counter-terror is unclear to me. It seems that he simply criminalizes the enemy of the partisans. The whole scenario is a highly interesting hybrid of the two different status juridiques, or the legal statuses, namely combatants and civilians, with two different types of modern warfare, namely hot war and cold war, between the occupation and the occupying power, which Schmidt's partisan, following Mao, joins a deux mains with both hands. What is astounding is only, and this is true a true political breakdown, conceptual breakdown. That is de-illegalization of Stalin's partisans at the expense of the classical international law is simultaneously linked with the Russo-Portalist doctrine of a pure war between states, concerning which Schmitt claims that it would have forbidden civilians from engaging in hostile acts, but only initially. In this way, the partisan becomes insurable. The 1945 Geneva Conventions are the work of a human disposition and a humanitarian development that are admirable. Given that they give the enemy not only humanity, but even justice in the sense of recognition, they remain based on the foundation of the classical international law and its tradition. Without such work of humanity would be improbable. Its fundament remains with the conduct of war based on the state and a bracketing of war with its clear distinctions between war and peace, military and civilian, enemy and criminal, state war and civil war. However, to the extent that these essential distinctions are loosened or even challenged, the door is open for a type of war that consciously destroys the clear separations. Then, many discreetly stylized, compromised norms appear only as a narrow bridge over an abyss, which conceals the successive transformation of concepts of war, enemy, and partisan. Development of the theory. Prussian incompatibility with the partisan. In Prussia, the leading military power of Germany, the uprising against Napoleon in early 1813 was fueled by a strong national feeling. The great moment passed quickly, however. It remains so essential in history of partisan warfare that later we must focus on it. First, however, we must take note of an undisputed historical fact, namely that the Prussian army and the German army, led by Prussia from 1813 through the early part of World War II, furnished a classic example of a military organization that repressed radically the idea of the partisan. The 30 Years' War of the German colonial domination of Africa from 1885 to 1915 were not important enough militarily to cause the extraordinary theoreticians of the Prussian General Staff to take the problem seriously. The Austro-Hungarian army had to deal with the partisan warfare in the Balkans and had a regulation for guerrilla warfare. By contrast, the Prussian-German army that marched into Russia on June 22, 1941, did not conceive of partisan warfare. Its campaign against Stalin began with the maxim, troops will fight the enemy, marauders will be handled by the police. The first special directives regarding fighting partisans only came in October 1941. In May 1944, scarcely 1 year before the end of the 4-year war, the first complete regulation of the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces regarding partisan warfare was instituted. That tells you something about the Germans, though, how, unprepared they were. In the 19th century, the Prussian-German army became the most famous and exemplary military organization in the European world, but it owed this reputation exclusively to military victories over other regular European armies, in particular those of France and Austria. Only during the Franco-German War, 1870-71, in France did it occur irregular warfare in the form of the Francs-Tireurs, who in Germany were called snipers, and were handled relentlessly according to the laws of war, just as had been done by every regular army. The more severely a regular army is disciplined, the more correctly it distinguishes between military and civil, and only the enemy in uniform is considered to be an enemy. A regular army becomes more sensitive and more nervous when it encounters a non-uniform civilian population on the other side of the struggle. Then the military responds with harsh reprisals, on-site inspections, hostile taking, destruction of villages, and considers this to be the correct self-defense against treachery and perfidy. The more the regular uniformed opponent is respected as an enemy, and also, in the most bloody struggles, is not considered to be a criminal, the more ruthlessly the irregular fighter is treated as a criminal. That follows from the logic of classical European laws of war. which distinguished between military and civil combatants and non-combatants, and which summoned the rare moral courage not to declare the enemy to be a criminal. The German soldier met francs-tireurs in France in the autumn of 1870, and on September 2nd achieved great victory over Napoleon III's regular army near Sedan. Had the war been fought according to the rules of classical regular army warfare, one could expect that after such a victory the war would have ended and peace would have been declared. But instead, the vanquished French imperial government was dismissed. The new Republican government under Leon Gambetta, proclaimed national resistance against the foreign invader. All-out war in even greater haste. It continually conscripted new armies and threw new masses of badly trained soldiers onto the battlefield. In November 1870, it had been a military success in the Loire Valley. The situation of the German army was threatened, and German foreign policy was endangered because a long war had not been foreseen. Once again, it's kind of a normal thing with Germans, isn't it? Where it's like, well, we didn't foresee this happening. We just wanted to fight a quick war. French population was aroused with patriotic fervor and participated in the struggle against the Germans in various forms. The Germans arrested dignitaries and so-called notables as hostages, shot francs-tireurs caught with guns in their hands, and pressured the population with all kinds of reprisals. That was the situation at the outset of more than half a century of struggle between international law jurists and public propaganda on both sides, for and against the francs-tireurs. The controversies flared again in World War I as a Belgian-German francs-tireurs struggle. Whole libraries have been written about the problem, and even in recent years, 1958 to 60, a panel of respected German and Belgian historians sought to clarify and resolve at least one controversial point in this complex problem of the Belgian francs-tireurs struggle of 1914. All this is illuminating for the problem of the partisan because it demonstrates that a normative regulation, it is conceived to be a factual state of affairs rather than just a collection of valuable judgments and general clauses. It is judicially or juridically impossible. The traditional European bracketing of wars between states emerged after the 18th century from specific concepts of bracketed war and just enemy derived from the age of monarchy. The concepts were interrupted by the French Revolution, but the Congress of Vienna reaffirmed them, and they became thereby much stronger. But they became legalized between states only when the belligerent states, both internally and externally, adhered to them in equal measure, i.e., when their domestic and foreign policy concepts of regularity and irregularity, legality and illegality, became substantively congruent, or at least more or less homogeneous in structure. Otherwise, instead of a demand for peace, war regulations between states were successful only in that they provided pretexts and slogans for reciprocal accusations. The simple truth is that this has been acknowledged gradually since World War I. Yet the facade of traditional conceptual inventory still is a strong ideologically. For practical reasons, states have an interest in utilizing so-called classical concepts. Also, in other cases, they are ignored as obsolete and reactionary. Furthermore, since 1900, jurists of European international law deliberately have repressed any recognizable picture of a new reality. When this is taken for granted with respect to the distinction between traditional European state war and the democratic war of national liberation, then, as Gambetta proclaimed in September 1870, the way is open for an improvised all-out war of national liberation. The 1907 Hague Convention, as did its collective forerunners in the 19th century, sought a compromise with respect to the francs-tireurs. It demanded certain conditions whereby an improvised fighter with an improvised uniform would be recognized as a combatant in the sense of international law, responsible leaders, firm and clearly visible badges of rank, and above all, open display of weapons. The consensual obscurity of the 1907 Hague Convention and the 1949 Geneva Convention is a great and complicated problem. The partisan is still the one who refuses to carry weapons openly, who fights from ambush, and who uses the enemy's uniform as well as true or false insignias in every type of civilian clothing as camouflage. Secrecy and darkness are his strongest weapons, which logically he cannot renounce without losing the space of irregularity, i.e., without ceasing to be a partisan. The military leadership of the regular Prussian army in no way was based on a lack of intelligence or on ignorance regarding the significance of guerrilla warfare. That one can see in an interesting book written by a typical Prussian general staff officer who knew the Franc-Tireurs War of 1870 to 71. Kolmar Freiherr von der Goltz. The author died in World War I as the leader of a Turkish army and was called Pasha Goltz. Oh, wow. There you go. That's some Karaboga stuff right there. We're getting to the Karaboga gang. In all objectivity and with great precision, the young Prussian officer recognized the decisive failure of the Republican military campaign and observed Gambetta wanted to lead the Great War and led it he did. But to his misfortune, because a small war, a guerrilla war, would have been much more dangerous for the German army in France at the time. Although also late, the Prussian-German Supreme Command ultimately did comprehend partisan warfare. On May 6, 1944, the Supreme Command of the German Armed Forces issued the guidelines for fighting partisans. Thus, before its own end, the German army rightly recognized the partisan. In the meantime, the guidelines of May 1944 also have been recognized as an extraordinary regulation by one of Germany's enemies. After World War II, English Brigadier General Aubrey Dixon, together with Otto Heilbrunn, published a significant book on the partisan, which reprinted extensively the German guiding principles as a typical example of the proper way to fight partisans. English General Sir Reginald F.S. Denning remarks in his foreword to the Dixon-Heilbrunn book that in his view, mentioning the German partisan regulation of 1944 did not detract from the book, that the guidelines of the German army dealt with the struggle against Russian partisans. Two events at the German war's end, 44 to 45, are not attributable to the German armed forces, but rather can be explained as the antithesis to them, the German Volkssturm and the so-called Wehrwolf. Yeah, for those that Wehrwolf, of course, was the very, very hastily prepared German, or I guess you could say Nazi partisans who really didn't work out that well. Basically, they were supposed to have Sturmgewehrs and bombs and whatnot. And the only success they had was killing the mayor of Aachen in 1945, and that was it. They kind of existed, but it really wasn't that much of a thing. But yeah, so that's what they're mentioning there. But yeah, it's surprising that, of course, it took the Germans 3 years to really come up with an actual manual to figure out how to take care of partisans. Of course, there were so many partisan units, like I say, with you had good old you had good old Dirlewanger, and you had all these various units such as the Bosnian SS unit, which were trying to get rid of Tito and his partisans in the Second World War. But I think that obviously it's for a different time. Okay, let me continue on here though. The Volkssturm created an edict on September 25th, 1944, as a territorial militia for national defense. During its operation, its members were considered to be soldiers in the sense of national defense regulations and as combatants in the sense of the 1907 Hague Convention. Their organization, outfitting, engagement, fighting spirit, and casualties are described in the recent publication of Major General Hans Kissel, who since November 1944 was the chief of the Volkssturm's operations staff. Huh. Let me look up this Hans Kissel right quick. Very interesting, though. Oh, okay, there we go. Yep. General Major. Wehrmacht. Yeah, not much else about him, but yeah, he was the guy that apparently led the Volkssturm officially, at least according to this book. Kissel reports that in the West, the Volkssturm was considered by the Allies to be fighting troops, whereas in the East, the Russians treated it as a partisan organization and shot the prisoners. Different from this territorial militia, the Werewolf were considered to be a partisan organization of youth. Dixon and Heilbrunn report on the outcome. Some few budding werewolves were caught by the Allies, and that ended the matter. Yeah. The werewolf was characterized as an attempt to unleash a children's sniper war. In any case, we did not dwell any further on this. Basically, yeah, they took the L. The werewolves weren't organized. The ammo dumps that they had, the secret caches of weapons weren't be able to be found and everything else. But yeah, the werewolves were a complete failure. But yeah, let's carry on with this though. All right. After World War I, the victors disbanded the German General Staff and forbade its reestablishment in accord with Article 160 of the Versailles Treaty of June 28, 1919. It was consistent with the logic of history and international law that the World War II victors, above all the United States and the Soviet Union, which meanwhile had outlawed war fought as a duel consistent with classical European international law, given their common victory over Germany, also outlawed and destroyed the Prussian state. Law number 46 of the Allied Control Commission of February 25, 1947 reads, "The Prussian state, which for long has been the agency of militarism and reaction in Germany, has de facto ceased to exist. Guided by the idea of the maintenance of peace and security of nations and with the wish to ensure further restoration of political life in Germany on a democratic basis, the Control Commission orders the following. Article 1, the Prussian state." Okay, you know what? We're going to go ahead and skip ahead here. So this is interesting with the Prussian stuff, but let's get to the good stuff, shall we? Oh, excuse me. Where's the stuff about Mao and Lenin? We're going to skip to page 48 here. There we go. From Clausewitz to Lenin. Here we go. Okay. Hans Jonerus, whom we have cited as an expert on the Partisan, titles a section of his comments, which he made. From Epicentro to Bugnani. That means from the partisan of the Spanish guerrilla war against Napoleon to the organizer of the Soviet cavalry, the leader of the Bolshevik War in 1920. Such a heading illuminates an interesting technical military line of development. However, for us who have the theory of the partisan in view, this consideration directs attention too much to the military technical questions of the tactics and strategy of mobile warfare. We must keep the development of the concept of political in view, which precisely here takes a subversive turn. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the classical fixed concept of the political was based on the state of European international law and had bracketed war in classical international law, i.e., they had made it purely state war. Since the onset of the 20th century, this state war, with its bracketing, has been destroyed and replaced by wars of revolutionary parties. For this reason, we use the following heading. from Clausewitz to Lenin. Obviously, in a sense, therein lies, in contrast to technical military limitation, a certain opposite danger, i.e., that we will become lost in historical philosophical diversions and genealogies. The partisan here is a surer focal point, because he is kept apart from the general philosophical historical genealogies and can lead us back to the reality of revolutionary development. Marx and Engels recognized that contemporary revolutionary war is no barricade war in the old style. Engels, in particular, who wrote many military treatises, always emphasized this, but he considered it possible that bourgeois democracy, with the help of universal suffrage, could create a proletarian majority in parliament, and thus legally could turn the bourgeois social order into a classless society. Consequently, one could say that Marx and Engels are now called for a completely nonpartisan revisionism. Not so with Lenin, who recognized the inevitability of force in a bloody revolutionary civil war and state war, and thus also approved of partisan warfare as a necessary ingredient of the revolutionary process. Lenin was the first to fully conceive of the partisan as a significant figure of national and international civil war. He sought to transform the partisan into an effective instrument of the Central Communist Party leadership. As far as I can see, this appeared for the first time in the article titled "The Partisan Struggle" in the Russian periodical The Proletarian, dated September 30th or October 13th, 1906. It is a clear extension of the recognition of the enmity and friendship that began in his 1902 pamphlet, What is to be Done? Above all, with the turn against Peter Struve's objectivism. Thereby, the professional revolutionary was consistently in place. Lenin's article on partisans concerns the tactics of socialist civil war and is directed against widespread social democratic opinion at the time that the goal of a proletarian revolution should arise independently as a mass movement in parliamentary countries, meaning that the direct application of force was outdated. For Lenin, partisan warfare was consistent with the methods of a civil war and concerned, like everything else, a purely tactical or strategic question of the concrete situation. Partisan warfare, as Lenin said, is an inevitable form of struggle, which one utilizes without dogmatism or preconceived principles, just as one must utilize other legal or illegal, peaceful or forceful, regular or irregular means according to the situation. The goal is the communist revolution in all countries. What serves this goal is good and just. Consequently, the partisan problem is also very easy to solve. If partisans are controlled by the Communist Central Committee, they are freedom fighters and glorious heroes. If they shun this control, they are anarchistic riffraff and enemies of humanity. Very important distinction. I know y'all are getting kind of bored of this, but it's okay. We're getting there, folks. I like that dialectic, though. The idea that, if they play by the rules of the Communist Central Committee, they're freedom fighters. If they shun this control, they're anarchistic riffraff and enemies of humanity. That's a very clear distinction. A very pragmatic and very true. Lenin was a great expert on admirer of Clausewitz. He had studied on war intensively during World War I, and in his notebooks he copied quotations in German and made comments in Russian with underscoring and exclamation marks. In this way, he created one of the most remarkable documents of world history and intellectual history. From a fundamental consideration of these quotations, marginalia, underscoring, and exclamation points, it is possible to develop new theory of absolute war and absolute enmity that has determined the age of revolutionary war and the methods of modern Cold War. What Lenin was able to learn from Clausewitz, and what he learned painstakingly, was not only the famous formula of war as a continuation of politics, it was the further recognition that the distinction of friend and enemy in an age of revolution is primary and that it determines war as well as politics. You didn't miss that much, Gurkhan. We're getting into the bit about Lenin right now. It was the further recognition that the distinction of friend and enemy, for Lenin, only revolutionary war is genuine war because it arises from absolute enmity. Everything else is conventional play. Lenin stressed the distinction between war and play in a marginal note on Chapter 23, Book 2, Key to the Land. Logically, this was a decisive step of the destruction of the bracketing of war between states in continental European international law that had been achieved in the 18th century. The Congress of Vienna was so successful in restoring the bracketing of war after the French Revolution that it lasted into World War I. Not even Clausewitz ever imagined that it would be destroyed. By comparison with a war of absolute enmity, the bracketed war of classical European international law, recognizing accepted rules, is similar to a duel between cavaliers seeking satisfaction. To a communist like Lenin, inspired by absolute enmity, such a type of war must have appeared to be mere play, which he might join if the situation demanded, but which basically he would find contemptible and ludicrous. The absolute war of enmity knows no bracketing. The consistent fulfillment of absolute enmity provides its own meaning and justification. The question is only, is there an absolute enemy, and who is he? And if so, who is he? For Lenin, the answer is obvious, and the fact that he made absolute enmity serious made him superior to all other socialists and Marxists. His concrete absolute enemy was the class enemy, the bourgeois, the essential capitalist, and the social order in countries where the bourgeois capitalist was dominant. Cognizance of the enemy was the secret of Lenin's enormous effectiveness. His understanding of the partisan was based on the fact that the modern partisan had become the true irregular, and thereby the strongest negation of the existing capitalist order. He was called the true executor of enmity. Today, the irregularity of the partisan consists not only in a military line, which was the case in the 18th century when he was only a light troop, and not only in the pride of wearing the uniform of a regular troop. The irregularity of the class struggle challenges not only a line, but the whole structure of political and social order. This new reality was conceived with philosophical consciousness by the Russian revolutionary Lenin, and the alliance of philosophy and the partisan that he forged unleashed unexpected new and explosive forces. It caused nothing less than the destruction of the whole Eurocentric world that Napoleon had hoped to rescue, and that the Congress of Vienna had hoped to restore. The bracketing of interstate regular war and the overcoming of intrastate civil war had become so accepted in the 18th century Europe, that intelligent men of the ancient regime also could not conceive of the destruction of this type of regularity, not even after the experiences of the French revolutions of 1789 and 93. For example, they found only the language of a general horror and made basically incongruous, childish comparisons. A great, courageous thinker of ancient regime, Joseph de Maistre, had foreseen brilliantly what was at stake. In a letter written in the summer of 1811, he declared that Russia was ripe for revolution, yet hoped that it would be, as he put it, a natural revolution, not an enlightened European revolution like the French. What he feared most was an academic Pugachev. Thus, he took pains to make clear what he considered to be the real danger, namely an alliance of philosophy with the elemental forces of an insurrection. Who was Pugachev? He was leader of a peasant and Cossack rebellion against Catherine II, who put a price on his head. He was executed in 1775. and academic Pugachev would be a Russian who started a European-style revolution that would produce a series of horrible wars. And if they went too far, I would not have the words to tell you what one would then have to fear. The vision of the smart aristocrats is astounding, as much as in what they saw, namely the possibility and danger of an alliance of Western intellect and Russian rebellion, as in what they did not see. With their timely and orderly dates, St. Petersburg in the summer of 1811, they found themselves to be in closest proximity to the Prussian military reformers. Yet, given their own nearness to the reform-minded professional officers of Prussian General Staff, they did not notice the intensive contracts that these officers still maintained. With the imperial court in St. Petersburg, they knew nothing of Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Clausewitz. And they failed to see the fatal flaw in thinking their names with Pugachev. The profundity in linking their names with Pugachev, of significant vision was lost, and what remained was bon mot, repartee, in the style of Voltaire or even Antoine de Rivarol. If one still thinks in terms of the alliance between Hegel's philosophy of history and the unchanged mass forces such as the Marxist professional revolutionary Lenin forged, then the formulation of the brilliant maestro would link to a small verbal effect in rooms or anterooms of the ancient regime. The language and conceptual world of bracketed war and prescribed enmity no longer were any match for absolute enmity. From Lenin to Mao Zedong. In the assessment of experts during World War II, Russian partisans diverted approximately 20 German divisions, thereby contributing essentially to the war's outcome. In his book of The Great Fatherland War, 1941-45, the official Soviet historiographer Boris Semyonovich Telpachovsky described the glorious partisans who wreaked havoc behind enemy lines. In the enormous spaces of Russia, which with seemingly endless fronts, thousands of kilometers long, every division of the German war effort was irreplaceable. Stalin's fundamental concept of partisans was that they must fight behind enemy lines, consistent with the maxim, in the rear, partisans at the front, fraternization. Stalin succeeded in linking the strong potential of national and homeland resistance, the essentially defensive Telluric power of patriotic self-defense against a foreign invader, with the aggressivity of the international communist world revolution. The linking of these two heterogeneous movements dominates contemporary partisan warfare around the world. Consequently, until now, a communist element has been in the forefront with its goal-oriented policy and its dependence on Moscow or Peking. The Polish partisans who during World War II fought against the Germans were sacrificed by Stalin in a gruesome way. He's referring to the destruction of Warsaw and everything else, and the uprising, the Warsaw Uprising. The partisan struggle in Yugoslavia was not only a common national defense against a foreign invader, but also a very brutal internal struggle between communist and monarchist partisans. In this fraternal struggle, the Communist Party leader Tito, with the help of Stalin and England, conquered and destroyed his internal Yugoslav enemy named General Draza Mihailovic, who originally had been supported by England. The greatest practitioner of contemporary revolutionary war became as well its most famous theoretician, Mao Zedong. Some of his writings are today required reading at Western war colleges. Since 1927, he had assembled experiences in communist actions and then used the 1932 Japanese invasion to develop systemically all modern methods of national and international civil war. The long march from southern China to the Mongol border began in November 1934. It covered approximately 12,000 kilometers and suffered enormous casualties. but it constituted a series of partisan achievements and experiences that culminated in the Chinese Communist Party becoming a peasant and soldier party with the partisans at the core. It is a significant coincidence that Mao compiled most important writings in 1936 to 1938, i.e., the same years in which Spain defended itself against a war of national liberation sponsored by the international communist movement. But in the Spanish Civil War, partisans played no significant role, whereas Mao credited the victory over the national opponent, Chiang Kai-shek, totally to the experiences of the Chinese partisan war against the Japanese and the Kuomintang. For our theme, Mao's most important formulations are found in a 1938 work titled Problems of Strategy in Guerrilla War Against Japan. Yet, other of his writings also must be mentioned in order to make this new Clausewitzian theory of war completely understandable. In fact, his theory of war is a consistent and systematic continuation of Prussian General Staff officers' concepts. Clausewitz, the contemporary of Napoleon I, could not have conceived of the degree of totality that today is obvious in the Revolutionary War of the Chinese Communists. The characteristic picture Mao provides is the following comparison. In our war, the armed people and small partisan war on one side and the Red Army on the other is comparable to the two arms of a man, or, to put it more practically, the morale of the people is the morale of the nation in arms. For this reason, the enemy is afraid. The nation in its arms, as is well known, this was also the slogan of the professional officers of the Prussian General Staff, who organized the war against Napoleon. Clausewitz was one of them. We have seen the strong national energies of a particular education level of the regular army already had been garnered at that time. Also, the most radical contemporary military thinkers also did distinguish between war and peace, and considered war to be a clearly separate state of exception from peace. As a professional officer of the regular army, Clausewitz could not think through the logic of the partisan as systematically as could professional revolutionaries like Lenin and Mao. However, with Mao, there is still a concrete factor with reference to the partisan, whereby he came closer than Lenin to the core of the matter, which made it possible for him to think the partisan through to the end. In short, Mao's revolution was tellurically based than was Lenin's. There are great differences between the Bolshevik avant-garde, which seized power in Russia under Lenin's leadership in October 1917, and the Chinese Communists, who in 1949 won in China after more than 20 years of war. Differences in their internal organizational structure, as well as in their relation to the land and the people they conquered, in view of the enormous reality determined by the telluric partisan, the ideological controversy concerning whether Mao taught a true Marxism or Leninism becomes as secondary as the question of whether old Chinese philosophers also made remarks similar to those of Mao. This question deals with a concrete red elite characterized by the partisan struggle. Most essential, as Ruth Fisher has formulated so clearly, is that the Russian Bolshevik of 1917, from a national standpoint, were a minority, led by a group of theoreticians whose majority were emigres. In 1949, the Chinese Communists under Mao and his friends had struggled for 2 decades on their own national soil with a national opponent, the Kuomintang, in an enormous partisan war. It may have been that their provenance was the urban proletariat, similar to the Russian Bolsheviks who hailed from St. Petersburg and Moscow. But once the Chinese Communists came to power, they brought with them the characteristic experiences of the most difficult defeats, together with the organizational competence to plant their core principles in a peasant milieu, and there to develop them further in a new, unforeseen way. Here lies the deepest origin of the ideological differences between Soviet Russian communism and Chinese communism, but it also can be traced to an inner contradiction in the situation of Mao, who linked the universal absolute global enemy, lacking any territorial space, the Marxist class enemy, with a territorially limited real enemy of the Chinese Asiatic offensive against capitalist colonialism. It is the antithesis of one world, i.e., a political unity of the earth and its humanity, and a plurality of large spatial political spheres, which are rationally balanced internally and in relation to one another. In a poem titled Kunlun, Mao depicted the pluralistic image of a new nomos of the earth. If I could stand above the heavens, if I could draw my sword and cut you into 3 parts, one piece for Europe, one piece for America, one piece left for China, then peace would rule the world. In the concrete situation, Mao encountered various types of enmity, which intensified into absolute enmity. Racial enmity against the white colonial exploiter, class enmity against the total capital. All right. Okay, let's continue on here. All right. In the concrete situation, Mao encountered various types. Okay. National enmity against the Japanese intruder. And the growing enmity against his own national brothers in long, bitter civil wars. All of this did not paralyze or relativize enmity, as one might have thought, but rather intensified and strengthened upon concrete situation. During World War II, Stalin successfully linked the Telluric partisan of the national homeland with the class enmity of international communism. In this respect, Mao was many years ahead of Stalin. Also, in his theoretical consciousness, Mao took the formula of war as the continuation of politics even further than did Lenin. Okay, yeah, of Earth as planet of the soil. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, that's what Telluric means. Okay. I had no idea what that meant. Anyway, I know y'all are getting bored, but we're getting there. We're going to finish up this bit with Mao, and then we'll call it good. During World War II, Stalin... Okay, yeah, we said that. Also, in okay. Mao's approach is as simple as it is effective. War has its meaning in enmity, because it is the continuation of politics. It also encompasses politics, at least as the possibility that there is always an element of enmity. And if peace contains the possibility of war, which from experience unfortunately is the case, it also contains a factor of potential enmity. The question is only whether enmity can be bracketed and included. Yeah, I'm here in this stream because Anna Cousin is having a problem with some text-to-speech advice. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, politics is conflict. Yeah, exactly. Okay, we're getting there. I know that. I know people are hanging on, and I know Anna Cousin is streaming. I'm going to try to finish this up, though. At least this bit about Mao Zedong. Okay. Practically speaking, there is thus the question of what is the quantitative relation between the actions of a regular army during hostilities and other methods of the class struggle that are not overtly military. Here, Mao found a clear formula. Revolutionary war is one-tenth overt. Regular war and 9/10 is not. Based on it, a German general, Helmut Stadtke, formulated a definition of a partisan is a fighter who pursues war for 9/10 and leaves 1/10 to the regular troops. Mao certainly did not overlook the fact that 1/10 is decisive for the end of the war. Yet, as Europeans of the old tradition, one certainly must emphasize that when one speaks of war and peace, one is referring to the conventional classical concepts of war and peace, of European bracketed war in the 19th century. Thus, not to an absolute, but only to a relative and bracketed enmity. The regular Red Army appears then only in the situation is mature enough for the communist regime. Only then does the land become openly occupied militarily. Of course, this does not have a reference to a peace treaty in the sense of classical international law. The practice of significance of such a doctrine was demonstrated most vividly after 1945 with the division of Germany. On May 8, 1945, the military war against defeated Germany ended. Germany then had surrendered unconditionally. Until today, 1963, there is still no formally concluded peace between Germany and the Allied victors. Until today, the borders between East and West are precisely those lines that American and Soviet regular troops drew as their zones of occupation 18 years ago. Both the relation with the 9-to-1 ratio of Cold War and open hostilities as well as the deeper world political symptomatic significance of the division of Germany after 1945 are for us only examples to clarify Mao's political theory. Its core lies in the partisan, whose essential characteristic today is true enmity. Lenin's Bolshevik theory recognized and acknowledged partisans, yet, by comparison with the concrete telluric reality of the Chinese partisans, there is something abstractly intellectual in Lenin's determination of the enemy. The ideological conflict between Moscow and Beijing, which has become increasingly stronger since 1962, has its deepest roots in this concrete dissimilar reality of the true partisan. Also here, the theory of the partisan proves to be the key to knowledge of political reality. So there we go. Yeah, war is peace. Yeah. And if peace exists somewhere, will benefit, more than someone else. Yeah. Yep. Let me see here. 60. We're on page 61. 95 pages. So I think we will try to continue. We will try to finish this tomorrow, but I appreciate everyone listening. That was a good long 2 hours and 13 minutes, wasn't it? But we got through quite a bit of this book. I skipped a bit about Prussia, but I said, we're going to just go ahead and skip past it. It wasn't too many pages. But we will continue on from Mao Zedong to Raoul Salan, I think, tomorrow. So I hope y'all enjoy that, and we'll probably go on and watch what Anand Kazin's doing. So yeah, we'll keep it there. See you later. Goodbye, everybody.